Though small in size, Rhode Island carries a surprising weight of mystery beneath its quiet landscape. From the debated markings carved into the Narragansett runestone to the submerged remains of entire communities beneath the waters of the Scituate Reservoir, the state holds stories that feel half-remembered and never fully explained. Beneath forests, shorelines, and still waters, Rhode Island quietly preserves echoes of explorers, settlers, and forgotten communities, each one leaving behind a story that invites curiosity but resists certainty. If you travel the quiet country roads of Hopkinton, Rhode Island, you could easily pass by one of the oldest human sites in the entire state without ever noticing it. There are no dramatic ruins, no towering walls, no obvious landmark announcing its presence. Instead, hidden deep in the forest near a small stream, a series of shallow granite overhangs rests quietly beneath the trees. These are the Tomquag rock shelters, a modest cluster of natural stone alcoves that once protected people thousands of years ago, long before European ships ever appeared along the New England coast. At first glance, the shelters look ordinary. To a casual hiker, they might seem like nothing more than random rock formations, the kind scattered across the wooded hills of southern Rhode Island. Moss blankets their surfaces, and roots twist down from the soil above. Leaves gather at their entrances as if the forest itself is slowly trying to hide them. But beneath those leaves, archaeologists discovered something extraordinary. Evidence that people lived here nearly 3,000 years ago. During excavations, researchers uncovered layers of soil containing charcoal from ancient fires, fragments of stone tools, animal bones, and tiny flakes of stone left behind while shaping blades or spear points. These small details revealed a long human story hidden inside the earth. Some of the earliest materials date back to around 800 BC, during what archaeologists call the Late Archaic period. Other artifacts belong to the Woodland period, more than 1,000 years later. That enormous gap tells an important story. It means that people didn't just pass through once. Generation after generation returned to these same rock shelters, using them again and again across centuries. Standing there today, it's easy to understand why. The granite ledges form natural roofs that keep rain off the ground. The shallow caves are just deep enough to block the wind while still allowing smoke from a fire to drift away. Nearby, a small stream flows through the woods, providing fresh water and fish. Long ago, the surrounding forests were rich with deer, wild turkey, and smaller animals. For early inhabitants, likely ancestors of the Narragansett people, this place would have been a perfect seasonal camp. They could hunt, fish, gather plants, and rest here before moving on with the changing seasons. The archaeological discoveries at the site offer quiet glimpses of those lives. In one shelter, scientists found the remains of ancient hearths, dark patches of charcoal and ash where fires once burned. In another, they uncovered piles of small stone flakes, the leftovers from shaping tools. These weren't ceremonial monuments or defensive structures, they were homes. Simple places where real people cooked meals, repaired tools, and waited out cold nights beside a fire. When I stood near the shelters, I tried to imagine what the place sounded like thousands of years ago. The crackle of flames reflecting off the stone ceiling, the steady rush of water in the nearby stream, the rhythmic tapping of someone striking stone against stone to shape a blade. Today, the shelters are silent. Their entrances are softened by moss and shadow. Fallen branches lean against the rocks as if the forest itself has taken over as their guardian. Yet there's still a strong sense of presence there, an awareness that human life once filled this quiet corner of the woods. One of the most intriguing aspects of the Tomquag rock shelters is how little we truly know about the people who used them. Because the site spans such a long period of time, archaeologists cannot say with certainty whether the same cultural group returned again and again, or whether different communities discovered the shelters centuries apart. The artifacts clearly connect to both the late Archaic and Woodland periods, suggesting that the site remained important for generations as cultures evolved. But beyond the objects left behind, the people themselves remain silent. There are no written records, no names, no stories preserved in words, only stones, soil, and fragments of everyday life. And yet, those fragments tell us something remarkable. For thousands of years, humans recognized the value of this exact place. The same outcrops provided shelter again and again across centuries of change. That continuity reveals something deeply human, our instinct to seek safety, warmth, and a place to belong wherever the land allows it. What makes the site so powerful is its simplicity. Unlike ancient cities or famous ruins, these shelters are small and humble. In some places, you have to crouch slightly to step beneath the rock. They weren't built to impress anyone. They existed purely out of necessity. But that humility is exactly what makes them meaningful. When you stand inside one of those shallow alcoves and look out toward the trees, you're seeing almost the same landscape that the first inhabitants saw thousands of years ago. The granite ledges are unchanged. The forest still breathes with the same damp scent of soil and leaves. The stream continues to flow quietly nearby. For a moment, time feels strangely thin. Of course, there are still unanswered questions about the site. Some researchers believe the shelters were used mainly during seasonal hunting trips. Others think small family groups may have stayed longer, using the area as a base for fishing and gathering. In many indigenous traditions, rock shelters also carried spiritual meaning, which raises the possibility that the site had ceremonial importance as well. Because the area is fragile and only limited excavations have been conducted, many of those questions remain open. Unfortunately, that fragility is also the site's greatest vulnerability. On the positive side, the shelters still survive in a peaceful stretch of forest, largely untouched by modern development. Archaeologists continue to study the artifacts, and organizations like the Tamaquag Museum help preserve and share the history of the region's indigenous peoples. But the site is delicate. Erosion slowly wears away the soil layers that hold archaeological clues. Tree roots push into the ground where ancient fires once burned. Even careless footsteps can disturb evidence that has rested undisturbed for thousands of years. For that reason, the exact location is not widely advertised. In a strange way, the shelters survive partly because most people don't know they exist. It's a quiet paradox. Protecting the past sometimes requires keeping it hidden. When I think about the Tamaquag rock shelters, I feel both awe and a kind of quiet sadness. Awe because the site connects us directly to the earliest people who lived in what is now Rhode Island, long before towns, roads, or even the name of the state existed. Sadness because so much of their world has disappeared, leaving only fragments behind. But those fragments are powerful. They remind us that history is not just the story of kings, wars, or grand monuments. Sometimes it's something far simpler. A small fire burning beneath a stone roof, a family resting after a long day of hunting, a place of shelter beside a stream. The people who used these shelters didn't think of themselves as ancient. They were simply living their lives, cooking, talking, trying to stay warm through the night. And somehow, through centuries of storms and seasons, the granite shelters kept their quiet memory alive. History, it turns out, isn't always written in books. Sometimes it waits patiently in the stone for someone willing to listen. In the center of Newport, Rhode Island, tucked inside a quiet green space called Turo Park, stands a strange stone structure that has puzzled visitors for centuries. People pass through the park every day. Tourists stroll by with ice cream, families push strollers along the paths, and most of them glance at the old tower only for a moment before moving on. But if you stop and really study it, something about it feels different. The arches are uneven, the stones are rough and weathered, and the entire structure looks far older than the peaceful town surrounding it. Locals know it simply as the Newport Tower. Officially, historians say it was built in the 1660s as a windmill by Benedict Arnold, the colonial governor of Rhode Island. According to this explanation, the tower was modeled after stone windmills he had seen in England. But unofficially, the tower has become one of New England's most enduring mysteries. The structure rises about 28 feet high and is made of thick stone and mortar, supported by 8 arches that lift the circular chamber above the ground. It almost resembles a small ancient monument, something that feels oddly out of place in a modern American town. For generations, people have debated who really built it. Some believe the windmill explanation makes perfect sense. In fact, Arnold's will even mentions my stone-built windmill, which many historians consider strong evidence that the tower was exactly what it appears to be. Yet, the mystery didn't stop there. In the early 1800s, a Danish scholar named Carl Christian Raff proposed a far more dramatic idea. Raff believed the tower might have been built by Norse explorers who reached North America around the year 1000. He linked the structure to the Viking sagas describing a distant land called Vinland. To Raff, the circular design and stone arches looked similar to Scandinavian architecture. His theory captured the public imagination, giving Newport a connection to the legendary voyages of the Vikings. Over time, the stories only grew more elaborate. Some claimed the tower was built by the mysterious Knights Templar, the medieval order that was suppressed in Europe in the 14th century. According to these theories, surviving members might have sailed west across the Atlantic.
Supporters of this idea point to supposed astronomical alignments in the tower's arches, suggesting they mark the sunrise or sunset during the solstices. It's a romantic theory, but one with no solid archaeological evidence. Other ideas followed. Some suggested early Portuguese navigators built it. Others proposed Chinese explorers. A few even argued that Irish monks might have constructed it centuries before Columbus. Each theory seemed to reflect the hopes of whoever proposed it, each one imagining that their culture had reached the shores of North America first. Standing in front of the tower, it's easy to understand why these ideas keep returning. The stonework feels ancient, lichens cling to the rough surface, and bits of sand and shell can still be seen in the old mortar. Inside, the arches create an unusual echo that makes the space feel hollow and strangely quiet. When sunlight passes through the openings, it forms shifting patterns on the ground. For a moment, you might wonder whether those patterns were intentional, whether someone once designed the tower with the sky in mind. Yet, archaeology tells a more practical story. Excavations in the 1940s uncovered fragments of 17th century artifacts beneath the structure, including charcoal and construction debris dating to Arnold's lifetime. These findings strongly support the windmill theory. Even so, questions remain. Some researchers point out that the walls are unusually thick for a colonial windmill. Others note that its circular stone design is uncommon among confirmed windmills built in New England during that period. There have also been discussions about whether the tower might have been built on top of an earlier foundation, though no clear evidence of an older structure has ever been confirmed. Every study seems to answer one question while raising another. Visit the tower on a foggy morning, and the place takes on an entirely different mood. The arches frame the mist like a curtain, and the salt air from the harbor drifts through the park. For a moment, it's easy to imagine explorers studying the stars or monks quietly passing through the shadows. Then a car drives by, and the spell breaks. You remember you're standing in the middle of a modern coastal town. That contrast, the ancient feeling of the tower against the everyday life around it, is part of its strange charm. In many ways, the debate over the tower says as much about people as it does about history. To historians, it's a simple colonial structure. To dreamers, it hints that the past might be far more complicated than we realize. And to many locals, it's simply the tower in the park, a familiar landmark that still manages to feel mysterious. Over the years, amateur researchers have measured every arch, checked compass directions, and searched for hidden carvings. Some claim to see crosses in its layout or alignments with stars and constellations. Others dismiss those ideas as wishful thinking. The truth is, the tower never fully explains itself. It looks too unusual to be just a windmill, yet it's too plain to be a temple or monument. That space between appearance and explanation is where the mystery lives. Modern technology, carbon dating, ground-penetrating radar, and archaeological surveys has largely confirmed a 17th century origin. Still, the legends refuse to fade. Even local tour guides sometimes pause before explaining the official story, smiling as they add, "Well, that's what the historians say." Today, the tower remains standing quietly in Rhode Island's coastal air. The stone is cracked in places, stained with weather and time, but the structure still holds firm after more than 3 centuries. On busy weekends, people gather nearby for photos and picnics. On quiet mornings, the tower can feel almost forgotten. But it never completely loses its mystery. Whether it began as a simple colonial windmill or something more unusual, the Newport Tower continues to do what it has done for generations: make people stop, wonder, and argue about the past. And perhaps that's its real purpose. Not to give us answers, but to remind us that history still holds a few secrets waiting in the shadows.
West of Providence, Rhode Island, the landscape begins to change. The roads narrow, the forests grow thicker, the air feels cooler and quieter. Hidden among those hills lies the vast expanse of the Scituate Reservoir, the largest body of fresh water in Rhode Island. Today it looks calm and untouched, an enormous stretch of blue surrounded by forest. But beneath that quiet surface lies something few people ever think about: entire villages, homes, churches, roads, fields once filled with families and farms, all of it now resting under the water. In the early 1900s, Rhode Island was growing rapidly, and the city of Providence needed a reliable source of clean drinking water. Smaller reservoirs and wells could no longer keep up with the demand of the expanding population. State officials began searching for a place large enough to supply water for decades to come. The valleys around what is now Scituate, Rhode Island, seemed ideal. Rivers flowed through low farmland, and the surrounding hills could easily contain a massive reservoir. But there was a problem. People already lived there. Nearly 1,500 residents were spread across several rural communities tucked into those valleys. Among them were villages like Rockland Village, Kent Village, Ashland Village, and South Scituate. These were not forgotten outposts. They were living communities with schools, churches, general stores, mills, and post offices. Families had farmed the land there for generations. Cemeteries held the graves of ancestors who had helped build those villages from the ground up. Yet once the reservoir plan was approved in 1915, their future was decided. The state began purchasing the land required for the project. Homes were bought, farms were closed, and entire neighborhoods were dismantled. Many residents resisted the plan, arguing that the payments offered for their properties were far below what their homes and land were worth. But the project moved forward anyway. Between 1915 and 1925, the valley slowly emptied. Buildings were taken apart or moved. Cemeteries were carefully relocated. Roads were erased from maps. For many families, it wasn't just the loss of property, it was the loss of a place where their history had been rooted for generations. Then came the final step. In 1926, the reservoir officially began operation. Water from the Pawtuxet River and surrounding streams backed up behind newly built dams, slowly filling the valleys. As the water rose, it covered everything that remained: barns, bridges, stone foundations, cellars, and orchard rows. The outlines of old roads disappeared beneath the surface, along with the physical memory of entire communities. Today, the reservoir spans more than 3,400 acres and supplies drinking water to hundreds of thousands of people across Rhode Island. From a distance, it looks peaceful. Great blue herons glide across the water. Deer move carefully through the forests along the shore. Wind ripples across the surface under an open sky. But there is something quietly haunting about the place.
Visitors quickly notice the fences and warning signs. The entire shoreline is strictly protected to preserve water quality. Swimming, fishing, boating, even approaching the water too closely is prohibited. This isn't a recreational lake, it's a protected water supply. Standing along the perimeter roads, you can look out over the water, but you cannot step down to the shore. The reservoir keeps its distance from the world around it. And that distance adds to the mystery. People who grew up nearby often share stories about what lies beneath the surface. Some fishermen claim that on exceptionally clear days, you can see faint shapes under the water, perhaps the outlines of old roads or stone walls. Others tell stories passed down from earlier generations, legends about church bells supposedly heard beneath the water after the reservoir first filled, echoing faintly through the valley. Whether those stories are real or simply the imagination of displaced residents is impossible to say. What is certain is that an entire landscape still rests beneath the reservoir. Foundations from mills, church steps from long-gone congregations, roads that once carried wagons between farms. For the descendants of those who lived there, the Scituate Reservoir is more than infrastructure. It's a memory. Many families still keep photographs of the villages that once stood in the valley. Some gather occasionally to share stories about the homes their grandparents were forced to leave behind. For them, the reservoir represents both loss and necessity. Their communities vanished, but the water that replaced them now sustains hundreds of thousands of people.
There is also a strange twist in that story. Because the reservoir area was closed to development, the surrounding land has remained largely untouched for over a century. Thousands of acres of forest have grown back, creating one of the largest protected natural landscapes in the state. Wildlife flourishes there now. In a way, the lost villages helped preserve something else, an entire ecosystem. Still, it's difficult to stand beside the reservoir without thinking about what once existed below. Photographers, historians, and local researchers often return to the area searching for traces of the past. Old maps, family records, and faded photographs help reconstruct what the valley once looked like before the water arrived. Some even call the reservoir Rhode Island's own version of Atlantis, a real place where an entire world disappeared beneath the surface. But the true mystery isn't supernatural. It's human. It's the question of what happens when progress overwrites memory, when communities are erased so that something larger can survive. Today, the reservoir remains both beautiful and distant. No ruins break the surface of the water. Only a few scattered historical markers along nearby roads hint at the villages that once stood there. The land feels peaceful, almost protective of what it hides. The benefits are clear: clean water, protected forests, and a vital resource for the state. Yet the silence carries another meaning too. If you stand there long enough, listening to the wind move through the pine trees, it's easy to imagine echoes of another time, perhaps the faint ring of a blacksmith's hammer, or children laughing in a yard that no longer exists. Of course, those sounds are only in the imagination. But when you look across the still water of the Scituate Reservoir, it can be difficult to separate memory from mystery. Deep in the wooded hills of Smithfield, Rhode Island, lies a place many locals still whisper about. They call it Hampton City, sometimes mistakenly remembered as Hampton City, the so-called lost city of Rhode Island. But calling it a city is misleading. It never truly was one. Today, the site is little more than a scattering of moss-covered stone foundations, old field walls, and fragments of history slowly dissolving into the forest. Trees grow where homes once stood. Roots twist through what used to be doorways and hearths. The land is quiet now, almost too quiet. There are no official signs pointing the way. If you want to find it, you usually need an old map, local knowledge, or the patience to follow faint trails that seem to disappear into the woods. Eventually, the forest opens just enough to reveal the first hint that people once lived here. A low stone wall, carefully stacked long ago, now half buried in leaves.
Step farther in and the feeling changes. The forest grows thicker, sound seems to soften, and suddenly you realize you're standing in the middle of something that time forgot. Hampton City is one of those rare places hiding in plain sight. Thousands of people pass near these woods every day without knowing that an entire settlement once existed here. Historical records suggest the area was settled sometime in the late 1600s or early 1700s. Back then, Rhode Island was still a patchwork of scattered farms and frontier communities. Families moved inland looking for land to farm, timber to cut, and space to build new lives. But the terrain here was never easy. The ground is rocky, the hills are uneven. Even today, it feels isolated, which raises a natural question: why would anyone build a community this deep in the forest? Most historians believe the answer is simple. Early settlers were often forced to work with whatever land they could claim. What we now see as wilderness was once farmland cleared by hand, stone by stone. And there are many stones here. Long rows of old field walls snake through the woods, marking boundaries that once divided small farms. These walls were built from rocks pulled out of the soil by farmers trying to make the land usable.
Over time, several families appear to have lived along what is now called Hampton City Road. The name itself likely came from an early resident whose surname was Hampton, though the exact details have faded from the records. Eventually, the settlement faded away. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, most of the homes had been abandoned. Families moved closer to growing towns, where roads, schools, and jobs were easier to reach. The forest slowly reclaimed the land they left behind. What remains today are quiet clues. Low stone foundations outline former homes. Collapsed walls suggest barns or small outbuildings. Here and there, you might see the base of an old fireplace or a shallow depression where a cellar once stood. In some parts of the woods, hikers have reported small burial sites, though many of the stones have sunk into the soil or disappeared entirely. Standing there, it's hard not to imagine the lives that once filled the place. Children running between cabins, smoke rising from chimneys in winter, farmers hauling stones from the fields to build the walls that still remain. And then, slowly, silence. Over the years, the mystery of Hampton City has grown larger than the facts themselves. With so few written records, the gaps have been filled with stories. Some locals claim the settlement was made up of exiles pushed out of nearby towns. Others say it was a refuge for debtors or runaway servants trying to live beyond the reach of authority. There are even darker legends, stories suggesting the village might have housed people suffering from disease who were forced to live away from the rest of society. But historians have found no evidence supporting those claims. They are almost certainly folklore, shaped by the lonely atmosphere of the place. And the atmosphere really is something special. Visitors often describe a strange stillness in the woods. The trees grow thick overhead, forming a canopy that muffles sound. On certain days, the air feels heavy and quiet, as if the forest itself is holding its breath. It's easy to understand why ghost stories grew out of that silence. Some hikers claim they've heard footsteps behind them when no one was there. Others say they've seen faint lights moving between the trees at night. Most likely, those stories come from imagination and the eerie mood of the forest. Still, when you're standing among the ruins, surrounded by stones placed by hands centuries ago, it's not hard to feel the weight of the past. I once walked out there with a friend who grew up nearby. We followed a narrow trail until it faded into tall grass. At first, there was nothing but trees. Then we saw the first wall. A low line of stones, perfectly balanced, stretching quietly into the woods. The deeper we walked, the more ruins appeared, one foundation after another, scattered like fragments of a forgotten puzzle. At one point, we found what looked like the base of an old hearth, its stones blackened long ago by fire. It was a small reminder that someone once called this place home. What makes Hampton City so fascinating isn't just the mystery of its past, it's the feeling you get while standing there.
The structures were built carefully using local stone. Even now you can trace the layout of what were once small homesteads. Whoever lived here intended their homes to last. Life simply moved on without them. One of the positive things about the site is that it's still accessible. Curious hikers, amateur historians, and local explorers continue to visit, documenting what remains before it disappears completely. There are no fences, no ticket booths, no guided tours, just history sitting quietly beneath the trees. But that freedom comes with a downside. Because the site isn't officially protected, some damage has occurred over the years. Stones have been moved, graffiti occasionally appears, and careless visitors sometimes leave trash behind. Nature is also doing its work. Tree roots push against the old foundations. Rain erodes the soil beneath them. Slowly but steadily, the forest is reclaiming everything. And yet, somehow, the place endures. Even without signs or maps, people keep finding their way there. They come with cameras, sketchbooks, or simple curiosity, hoping to piece together a story from the scattered remains. In the end, Hampton City isn't really about ghosts or hidden treasure. It's about time. It's a reminder of how easily entire communities can vanish, leaving behind only faint traces in the landscape. The people who lived here didn't leave grand monuments or famous records. They left stone walls, foundations, a few names on old maps, small signs that they once existed. Today, the forest keeps most of their story to itself. The walls still wind through the trees, marking boundaries that no longer matter. If a cemetery remains, it's likely just a few weathered stones hidden under leaves. The silence there isn't frightening, it's reflective. The kind of silence that makes you listen more carefully to the wind in the branches, to the crunch of leaves beneath your feet, and to the faint echo of lives that history never fully recorded. That is the real mystery of Hampton City. Not who built it, but how quickly the memory of ordinary lives can fade until only the forest remembers they ever were there.
Just off the quiet shoreline of Narragansett Bay, near the coastal town of North Kingstown, Rhode Island, there once lay a weathered stone that sparked one of Rhode Island's most curious historical debates. It became known as the Narragansett Runestone, sometimes called Quidnasset Rock, a slab of gray stone etched with mysterious markings that no one has ever been able to fully explain. At first glance, it looked ordinary, a rough piece of coastal rock resting in shallow water near Pojack Point. At low tide, it was visible from the shore, partly exposed as the water pulled back from the bay. But carved into one of its flat surfaces were dozens of strange symbols, lines, angles, shapes that seemed almost deliberate. To some observers, they looked eerily similar to ancient Norse runes. To others, they looked like nothing more than scratches. And that disagreement is where the mystery began. For years, the stone was mostly known only to locals, fishermen, boaters, and residents who had grown used to seeing it during low tide. But in the late 20th century, the markings began attracting wider attention. Researchers and amateur historians started examining the rock more closely. Across its face, they counted roughly 50 rune-like symbols, unevenly spaced and cut with what appeared to be hand tools. The grooves were irregular, not precise like modern engraving, which only deepened the intrigue. The big question quickly became obvious. Who carved them? And when? One of the most exciting theories suggested the stone might be connected to Viking explorers. For centuries, stories have circulated about Norse sailors reaching North America long before Christopher Columbus. That possibility was dramatically confirmed when archaeologists discovered the Viking settlement at Lonzo Meadows in Newfoundland and Labrador, clear evidence that Norse explorers crossed the Atlantic around the year 1000. To believers, the Narragansett runestone seemed like a tantalizing clue that those voyages might have extended much farther south. After all, Rhode Island already had its own mysterious structure, the Newport Tower, which some alternative historians have also tried to link to Norse explorers. Could Viking sailors have reached the shores of Narragansett Bay? It's a thrilling idea, but most scholars remain skeptical. Experts in runic writing have pointed out that the markings on the stone don't clearly match any known Norse alphabet. Some characters resemble runes, but others appear inconsistent or incomplete. Instead of a coherent inscription, the markings look more like a mixture of shapes drawn without a clear linguistic system. Because of that, many researchers believe the carvings are far more recent. Some suggest they may have been made by colonial settlers experimenting with strange symbols. Others think fishermen or sailors could have carved them out of boredom during long days on the water. There's even the possibility that the stone was carved as late as the 19th or 20th century. Without artifacts, tools, or a datable archaeological layer connected to the carvings, determining the age of the markings has proven nearly impossible. The stone offered no explanation, no translation, no historical record, no clues about its creator, just symbols cut into rock. Then, in 2012, the story took a bizarre turn. One morning, residents noticed something strange. The stone was gone. The Narragansett runestone had completely vanished from the bay. At first, it sounded like a rumor, but it quickly became clear that someone had actually removed it. Local authorities launched an investigation, and historians worried that an important artifact, whatever its true age, had been stolen. For several months, the mystery deepened. Then the stone reappeared. It was eventually recovered near a yacht club a few miles away, apparently abandoned after being taken from its original location. Exactly who moved it and why was never publicly confirmed, but the incident made something clear. The stone had become more than just a curiosity. It had become part of Rhode Island's local folklore. After it was recovered, officials decided it needed protection. Instead of returning it to the tides of Narragansett Bay, the stone was placed in secure storage and later displayed in a safer setting where it could be preserved. Seeing it up close today creates a strange feeling. The carvings are rough and uncertain. They don't have the precision of formal inscriptions, yet they don't look completely random either. There is a rhythm to the lines, a sense that someone long ago, or perhaps not so long ago, was trying to communicate something. Maybe it was a message. Maybe it was simply an experiment. Or maybe it was a prank that accidentally grew into legend. Every explanation seems possible, and none can be proven. That uncertainty is exactly what gives the stone its power. You can stand in front of it and feel as though you're looking at a message from a distant past, one that time has partially erased but never fully silenced. If you visit the coastline near Narragansett Bay today, the landscape adds to that feeling. The water stretches wide and calm. Rocky shorelines meet clusters of reeds and tidal flats. At low tide, the muddy bottom glitters with shells and dark stones, while the wind carries the faint scent of salt. It's easy to imagine a small Viking vessel slipping along the horizon centuries ago. It's just as easy to picture a lonely fisherman pausing beside the rock, carving strange shapes into its surface on a quiet afternoon. The truth may lie somewhere between those possibilities. Humans across cultures have always carved symbols into stone, sometimes to mark territory, sometimes to leave messages, and sometimes simply to say, "I was here." Perhaps that's all this stone ever was. A small human gesture that somehow survived long enough to become a mystery. Today, the Narragansett runestone is protected from the tides that once washed over it. The positive side is obvious. The carvings will no longer erode away beneath waves and salt water. But something has changed. Removed from the shoreline where it once sat, the stone feels quieter, almost detached from the landscape that gave it meaning. Under indoor lights, it becomes an artifact. Out in the bay, it was a story. Even so, it continues to draw curious visitors, local historians, students, and travelers intrigued by the possibility of a Viking message hidden in Rhode Island. Most leave with more questions than answers, and maybe that's exactly what keeps the mystery alive. Because whether the carvings are ancient or modern, the Narragansett runestone reminds us of something important. History isn't always clear. Sometimes it's just a few lines cut into stone, waiting for someone centuries later to wonder what they mean.